I was wimpy, the Army would have done much better. A lot of Air Force guys are scared of the word hua because they think it's strictly Army. But let me tell you, hua is a religious term. I speak Hebrew, and hua comes from the Old Testament book of Micah. Micah's name in Hebrew, Mai means who, and is short for Jehovah. So his name means who is like Jehovah. So if you read his little book, it's just a little bitty book. It'll take you 10 minutes to read it. But throughout the book, he's doing a play on his name. So he's saying, who is like God who can do this, and who is like God who can do that? Who, That's my story, and I stick with it, and it's not true. In some ways, it's awkward being a chaplain general. We chaplains spend our whole lives saying, well, all I want to be is a humble little chaplain doing the work of the Lord. And we mean it. But then one of us gets promoted to general officer, and suddenly the whole world changes. People stand when you walk in. People open the door for you. Some people even listen when you speak. I remember when I first became a one-star, when I pinned on my first star, I walked into a large hangar. I just started doing what I'd always done as a chaplain, just going around asking people about their lives, asking people about how they're doing, just asking about their families, and then bringing them a good word, a word of encouragement, pat them on the back, and sometimes stepping on their toes. And I remember walking in a really large hangar a day or two after I pinned on, and I had an NCO friend with me, and I just started walking up to people and saying hello. I'm kind of shy, and so I start out kind of slow, and suddenly somebody in the big hangar shouted out, "Tin Hut!" So I popped to attention like this, and I'm standing there, and after a few awkward seconds, the NCO that was with me said, Sir, it's you. Well, I had no idea. I mean, it just didn't occur to me that people would stand to attention for a chaplain. And you're supposed to say something like the general says, or like the wing commander says, like "carry on, men," or "as you were," or something like that. But I was totally flustered, totally beside myself, totally taken off guard. And I stood there and I said, "As you was!" And that began my career as a chaplain general officer. Well, as I said, it's really awkward being a chaplain general, but the truth is I pinned on my first star long before I ever become a chaplain. I was in college, and I was going to college on the GI Bill, and the GI Bill paid $175 a month, and that was something I was very, very thankful for, but there was no way that would be enough to make it through college. So I came up with what I thought was an absolutely brilliant idea. I decided that I would spend my college years living in my car. I had an old 1962 Chevrolet Biscayne. It leaked oil, belched smoke. It had rust all over it so that people could always tell where I'd parked because it left a big rust ring around it. It lost a part every time I hit a bump, but it had a big back seat. And I thought, well, I can just sleep in the back seat with a blanket or a sleeping bag, and I can put a pillow back there, and that would be just fine for me. I'll take my showers in the college gym, and I'll just live in my car. Went all the way through college. Well, let me tell you, friends, it worked perfectly. Perfectly. For 3 days. And then somebody snitched on me, and the school administrators called me in, and they read me the riot act. They said, no student of ours is going to be living in a car. And they gave me two very clear demands. They said, number one, you're going to get a place to live. And number two, you're going to get a job. Now, place to live wasn't too hard. I started walking from the campus. The car wasn't running that day, as it often wasn't. And so I walked all over the town. I mean, I just walked everywhere looking for a for rent sign. And I saw several of them, but the places were too nice. And finally, I saw this old house that looks like it ought to be in a monster movie. And it had a for rent sign in front of it. And I thought, well, I can rent that house. So I walked in, I talked to the landlord, and it turned out that he had divided the old house into 3 different apartments, but I couldn't afford any one of them. It was nowhere close to what I could afford. So I talked to him for a few minutes and started to leave, and he mentioned to me that when they divided the old house into apartments, they had a bathroom left over. And I said, how much for the bathroom? He said, $35 a month. So, Chaplain, where did you spend your college years? I lived in the bathroom. And it really wasn't that bad. I put boards over top of the bathtub, and I put my cot on top of that and a pillow, and in the morning I just push the boards aside, fall in, and everything was good for my living conditions. The job, however, was really hard. It was in September, just when school was starting, and all the summer jobs, all the student jobs had been taken, and I walked all over that town. I mean, I walked and walked and walked. It was a 3-day weekend, Labor Day, and they told me I had to have a job by Tuesday morning. So I had Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And I walked everywhere, and I knocked on every door I could possibly knock on, asking for a job. Please, I need a job for school. And finally, on Friday afternoon, late afternoon, I landed an entry-level job with a large oil company. I became a gas station attendant, and I wore a big, bright Texaco star. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but that job was perfect preparation for a pastor. For at the Cloverleaf Texaco in Springfield, Missouri, I met one each of every type of person that God has ever created. I remember one night I was standing out. I worked nights. I worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And I remember one night I was standing out talking to this Baptist guy who worked at the gas station beside us. He was an old guy, real old, like maybe 30. And he had been a pastor and came back for more education. So around 2 o'clock in the morning, 2:30 in the morning, after the traffic had died down and I had scrubbed down the driveways, I would walk over to his side and we'd stand in the middle and we'd talk about the finer points of theology, and I'd just pepper him with questions about what it was like to be a pastor. And we were standing there one night talking, and this lady pulled in. This is a true story. This lady pulled in on my side, and she came up to my pumps, and so I started walking that way to pump her gas. You see, back in those days, back in the late 1800s when I was in college, they had this thing called full service. You probably never heard of it because you're far too young, but it was an amazing concept. You would drive into a gas station, a bell would go off, a young fuzzy-headed fellow would come running out with an oil rag in his back pocket, that would be me, and he'd say, "Fill her up, sir," and I would fill up your gas, I would check the air in your tires, I would wash your windshield, and I would check your oil, all at no extra charge. No problem. That's just the way it was back then. And so she came in, and I thought, well, I'll just go over there and fill up her car. Well, she drove right past the pumps. She came right up to us. She jumped out of the car, left the engine running, left the door open, and she came up to us and she said, "Boy, am I glad you guys are open." She said, "I just left the party, and I'm telling my friends that I've owned this car for 6 months, and I've never changed the air in the tires." She said, "Can you change the air in the tires?" And I thought to myself, man, that must have been some party. And so I started to talk to her, but my Baptist friend, the old guy, he put his hand out and kind of pushed me back a little bit, and he said, "Well, Cecil, I'll take care of this." So he walked up to her. I know it doesn't sound true, but it is. He walked up to her and he said, "Ma'am," he said, "we'd be glad to change the air in your tires. Cecil here, my friend, would be glad to do it. I'd be glad to do it, but we got to be honest with you. See that Citgo station across the street over there?" He said, "This week and this week only, they're having a special on pink air. And if you go over there, you can get pink air for the same price as regular air." And she said, "Really?" And he said, "Oh, yes." So she drove over to the Citgo station, and a few minutes later, the Citgo guy was raising his fist up in the air and yelling something about wacko preachers across the street. But as I said, I learned a lot at the gas station. I learned, first of all, that I should never trust a Baptist preacher. That's helped me a lot. Yeah, I'm kidding. Secondly, I learned that the weirdos come out at night. The hippies, the nudists, the human subculture groups, all God's special little creatures come crawling out of the woodwork when it gets real dark. But most of all, and here I get serious, most of all I learned that ministry means being there. It's more than just preaching sermons and manning the chapel and making bulletins. It means being there when people pull off the interstates of life, when they're overheated, when they're frustrated, when they need directions, when they just don't know which way to go, when they've reached an intersection in their life and they don't know which way to turn. And that's what a chaplain is. It's someone who's there for you. It's someone who's being there. Did you hear the one about the rabbi and the priest and the 2 Protestant ministers who went out for a cruise late one night? Well, I hope you have, because it's one of the most powerful and inspiring true stories in the history of America, and it's about chaplains. It was the Uss Dorchester. It was February 3rd, 1943. There were 907 souls aboard, and they were heading to Thule, Greenland to do their part in World War II. All the 907 men had been told to wear their life vests at all times, 24 hours a day, even sleep in them, because there were German submarines in the area, and they were in a very, very dangerous trip. Well, it was hot down in the hold of this ship. It wasn't much bigger than this with 900 people in it. It was hard to sleep. And most of the guys, not just some of them, but most of the guys took off their life vests and used them as the pillow and tried to just wear their boots and strip down because it was so horribly hot with so many people in the hold of that little ship. Well, around 2 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of February 1943, a torpedo hit the Dorchester, followed in rapid succession by another torpedo. And the ship's captain gave the abandoned ship order, and the people came flooding up out of the hold, just pushing their ways up out of the hold. Most of them didn't have a life vest. There were 4 chaplains on that ship that day: a rabbi, a priest, Roman Catholic, and 2 Protestant ministers. They grabbed the axes off the walls of the ship and they chopped down the doors to the ship's stores. And they grabbed all the extra life vests and they threw them to the men, to the soldiers, and they said, "Jump and save your life, and jump and save your life." But after a while, they were out of life vests and there were still a few dozen people there. And one by one, the 4 chaplains took off their own life vests and they handed them to a soldier. And they said, "Jump and save your life." And as the men bobbed up and down in the water, some in lifeboats, some just right in the water itself on that moonlit night, they saw what they talked about for the rest of their lives, and some of them are still living, and I've talked to them. They said that the ship went from this way to this way. And then they saw the 4 chaplains. The chaplains linked their arms, and they worked their way up to the bow of the ship. And from the bow of the ship, the chaplain started yelling out to the men in the water, saying, "Hold on, keep your faith, trust in God, don't give up, help is coming, hold on, don't give up." And then one by one, the chaplains, according to their own faith, they prayed a prayer for the men in the water and for their families. And then the chaplains on the bow of the ship held hands with one another, and they began singing a hymn. And as they sang, the Dorchester went under, and the chaplains gave their lives for their men and for their country. If anybody ever asked you what a chaplain is, tell them about the rabbi and the priest and the 2 Protestant ministers who went out for a cruise late one night. The day I graduated from high school, I stuffed some underwear in a brown paper bag and I put $3 in my pocket. I walked up to the head of my driveway and I stuck out my thumb and I began life on my own, never to return. After a few hours of hitchhiking and walking, I finally landed a job with an elderly couple who said that they were going to Rockford, Illinois. And I said, "Oh, that's where I'm going." Well, I'd never been to Rockford, Illinois. I didn't know anything about Rockford, Illinois, but I decided, well, that's where I'll start my life. When I got to Rockford, I wandered the streets, sleeping on park benches and under trees. And finally, I landed a job at J.I.K.'s Tractor Company. It was on Independence Avenue, for those of you from Rockford. It's State Street, Route 20. It was there, at J.I.K.'s Tractor Company, that a major chapter of my life's education began. The job was hard, the pay was pitiful, but the people were fascinating. Most of them had very little education. Some of them couldn't read or write. Most of them actually had no hope of ever progressing in life. They acted as though they were trapped in the factory with no chances of escaping the back-breaking wages and hard work. The truth is, I fit right in with them. I had no vision, no ambition, no hope of ever bettering myself. I was just a young kid who was drifting without an anchor. I was hoping beyond hope that someday I might be able to go to college, but I knew better. I knew I had almost zero chance of that. I was raised in the forest of Appalachia. Most of my family, most of them, could not read or write at all. My father was severely handicapped. He was an alcoholic and he was a child beater. He was mad at the world, and as I get older, I can kind of understand, but at the time I couldn't understand at all why my father would pick me up and beat me so badly. He would often pick me up by the hair of the head and pound me with his fist. It was before the days of reporting child abuse, and so I would go to school with my eyes so swollen I couldn't see the board. The place where I would sleep would be covered with blood from the beatings on my back. That's just the way I lived. They say that if you kick a dog, he becomes mean. Well, I tell you, if you kick a boy, he becomes mean too, and I became mean. I grew up mean. I grew up in break-ins. I grew up in petty crime. I grew up running from the police all the time. I grew up in one fight after another. I had no spiritual foundation, and I had never been in church in my life. When I got the JI case, I just assumed that the rest of my life would be spent working in a factory, just like my extended family. But 8 months later, totally out of the blue, my world was turned upside down when I got a letter from my uncle, Uncle Sam. Sam was having a little war in Vietnam, and he wanted me to come join him. My friends and I in the factory were 18 years old when we got our draft notice. We didn't know anything about the military. We didn't know what was in store for us. We knew that we lived in a great country, and we knew that if America needed us to come fight for her, then we would come fight for her. But there was one guy in our group, a guy named Denny. Denny was afraid of the draft. Denny didn't want to enlist. Denny didn't want to leave home. But instead of burning his draft card or running off to Canada, like so many did in those days, Denny took a shotgun, went out behind his house. Denny laid the shotgun on his foot, and he blew his foot off. Denny didn't want to be drafted, and he wasn't drafted. He didn't want to pass the physical, and he didn't pass the physical. He didn't want to serve his country, and he has never served his country one day in his life. But I submitted to you this morning that Denny lost a lot more than a foot that day. For Denny has never known what you know. Denny has never done what you've done. Denny has never been where you've been. Denny has never looked in the mirror and counted the stripes on his sleeve or polished the brass on his shoulder. Denny has never known the feeling you get when you stand at attention at a retreat ceremony. He's never known what it's like to salute the flag and watch it wave across the blue sky. Denny has never known what it's like to be a part of a band of brothers and sisters who more than self, their country love, and mercy more than life. Today, my friend Denny works as a janitor in a high school in southwest Wisconsin. And I don't know of anybody who lives a more dull life as he limps on an artificial foot through the high school hallways. I'm not angry at Denny for what he did. I'm not holding any animosity against him that I was drafted and he wasn't. He was just a young kid who got scared and did something really, really stupid. But as for me, I'm ever thankful that the guys in the factory told me that if I enlist in the military instead of being drafted, I might be able to go to a school. And more than anything, I wanted to go to a school. I wasn't thinking college. I mean, that was totally, I had no idea about the GI Bill. I didn't know about that. I was thinking maybe I could become a carpenter or a plumber or a mechanic or some wonderful thing like that. Anything that would get me out of the factory. And I remember going down to the recruiters after work one morning. I worked nights there too, and I went down to the recruiters, still dirty from work. I saw the 4 recruiters in Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And I thought, Marines, that's me. I fight a lot. I'm in the Marines. So I went in and I joined the Marines. And I went back that night to the factory and I said to the guys, well, guys, I joined the Marines yesterday. And one of the guys, I've often thought it might have been an angel. I don't know which guy it was. But one of the guys said, oh, Cecil, the Air Force has nicer uniforms. And that's not true at all. I mean, the Marines have awesome uniforms. But I didn't know. So the next day, I went back to the recruiting office, but this time I went to the Air Force. And I said, look, I joined the Marines yesterday, but can I join the Air Force instead? And he looked at the situation, and he looked at my test scores and all that stuff, and he said, well, if you enter the Air Force before you were supposed to go in the Marines, yes. And that's how I got in the Air Force. But let me tell you this. I will never, ever, ever regret enlisting in the United States Air Force. For it was as an enlisted man in the Air Force that I learned discipline. It was as an enlisted man in the Air Force that I learned things like duty and honor and courage and self-sacrifice. It was in the Air Force that I learned that every American can have a chance. And best of all, it was in the Air Force that I found purpose and direction and meaning for my life and my calling in my life. You say, well, how does a guy who's really a criminal, who's never been to church, how does he ever become the chief of chaplains? Well, they tested me in basic and they found out that I had a proficiency for languages I didn't know. I ended up being sent off to Syracuse University to study Russian and be in an immersion program. And I became a Russian interpreter, and I was good at it, but I was a bad airman, real bad airman. I was always in fights, always in trouble. I was the first sergeant's nightmare. I got in a fight one time and threw a guy out a third-floor window, and the only thing that kept me out of jail was the fact that he was a bigger criminal than I was. I got in another fight with a guy, and we fell into somebody's room. The other guy had been ironing his clothes, and I was kind of losing the fight. In fact, I was really losing the fight. So I reached up and I grabbed the iron, and I ironed the man that I was fighting. And to this day, his body's scarred up from my ironing. Now, I'm not proud of that. That's just what I was. And you say, this is a chaplain? Yeah. After that, I got sent to Goodfellow Air Force Base for intercept school. And there at Goodfellow, my life changed. I didn't straighten myself out. Couldn't do it. My life changed when I started looking for girls. I had just turned 20 years old, and I decided I really want to meet a girl. So I went to bars, and I went to parties, and I went to all the places you're supposed to go to meet girls, but I couldn't meet any girls. I wasn't any good at it. Finally, I thought to myself, hey, Cecil, why don't you go to a church? I bet there's girls in church. I'd never been to a church, but I thought, this is San Angelo, Texas. There are churches everywhere. So I walked off base, and I saw a church, and I remember going up the steps, and I stopped about halfway up the steps, and I thought to myself, man, they probably charge at the door, like the movies, because you've never been to church, you don't know how it works. And I figured they probably charged you as you went in the door, and I thought, well, I don't want the religion, I just want to meet a girl. So I came back down the steps, I went around the back, and I sneaked in the back. I became a church crasher. And I went in there, I sat down, I sat back over like in that area there, and I was just looking for girls. And I was walking around, I was just looking around. And on the side, guys, if you're looking for a girl, the church is the place. There's a lot of them. And I was looking at these girls, and there's an old white-haired guy up front talking. And it turned out he had been a missionary to India for 28 years, and he was just talking away, and I didn't pay much attention to him. But after a while, I started listening to what he had to say. And as he talked, suddenly, something happened to little Airman Cecil Richardson. Something happened to my heart. And I couldn't explain it. I knew it was happening. Something was happening inside of me. And the pastor said, if you want to get your heart right with God, then get out of that pew and come down and kneel at this altar. Remember, I was a rough guy. I really was. I was just raised that way. I was mean, just mean. And there was an old lady to my left. I turned around and I pushed her. And I said, get out of the way. And I rushed down to the altar. How's that for starting off on your religious life? And I knelt at the altar. And a bunch of people came around and laid hands on me and prayed for me. And I don't know what I said. I don't know what I did. It was just all new to me. But I can tell you that at that altar, I found the calling and the meaning of my life. And I found the answer to the most important questions. Questions like, who am I? And why am I here? And what's the meaning of life? And is there anything worth living for? And even more important, is there anything worth dying for? Now, this is not a religious setting, and this is not a religious talk, but I am a chaplain, and I got to tell you where I'm coming from. And that's where I'm coming from. A few years ago, a group of terrorists bombed the American embassy in Nairobi, Kenya. It was a truck bomb. There were over 1,000 people wounded and hundreds were killed. I was there when it happened. I was the chaplain for that embassy. It would be too emotional to tell you all that transpired. It'd be too emotional for you to hear, too emotional for me to speak. And that's really not the focus of my talk. I only mention it because those of us who have been in the military very long, those of us who have seen such things, those of us who have known war up close and personal, those of us who have seen carnage and zipped up body bags and made death notifications, we've had plenty of occasion to ask ourselves if there's anything worth fighting for. We've had plenty of occasion to ask ourselves if there's any values at all that must be defended. We've had plenty of occasion to ask ourselves, is there anything in this whole world that's worth dying for? Well, fellow airmen, I want to say to you this morning, I served 41 and a half years in the United States Air Force. 6 years enlisted, 35 and a half as a chaplain. I've walked on our nation's battlefields, all of them since Vietnam. I've stood in bombed out buildings with my uniform saturated with blood. I've carried human remains in my hat, and I've held the hands of brave Americans who were breathing their last and going to be with God. I've knocked on doors in the middle of the night, and honestly, there have been many times when I have prayed that no one would be home so that I wouldn't have to speak the words that I had been sent to say. I have sat by the hospital beds of some of the greatest heroes our nation has ever known, and far too many times, I've stood at Arlington National Cemetery and I've rendered a final salute to those who had given their all in service to our nation. And friends, I want you to know for certain that there are some things worth dying for, and there are some things worth fighting for, and there are some things worth living for. You can't really live until you love someone so much that you would die for them. You can't really live until you love something so much that you would die for it. And I'm talking about your family, your friends, your values, your faith, your freedom, your country. I've traveled all over the world. I've been to 131 countries in all 50 states, and I can tell you from personal experience that America is the greatest and the freest and the most decent society in all the world. It is an oasis of goodness in the desert of barbarism. When young men and young women like yourselves join the United States military and you wear an American uniform, you bind yourself by invisible cords to those great patriots who defended our freedoms at Yorktown and Gettysburg and Iwo Jima and Fort Chop Hill and Normandy and the Kuwaiti Desert and Roberts Ridge and downtown Baghdad and 1,000 other places that most of the world has never heard of. Just a few years ago, while I was still in active duty, I retired a little over 2 years ago. While I was still in active duty, I preached in one of those mega churches in Dallas. Some of you from Dallas, you probably know the church. It had thousands of people in it. And I preached there, and I wore my Air Force uniform like I always did, you know, explaining what the Air Force does and who we are and how wonderful our people are. And I preached the Bible just like I would in any other setting. But after the service, as people were filing out and I was greeting them, and it had been maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and there were still some people lingering around, this little Texas lady, little blue-haired Texas lady, came up to me, and she spoke to me in the way that only the little blue-haired Texas ladies can speak. And she said to me, "Are you a minister?" And I said, "Well, yes, ma'am, I am." I thought it was obvious. I mean, I just preached the sermon. I thought it was obvious. And she said, "Well, I thought all ministers were anti-war." It took me off guard for a minute, and I said, "Well, yes, ma'am. All ministers are anti-war. And you would be interested to know that all military people are anti-war. All firemen are anti-fire. All policemen are anti-crime. But sometimes in this world you have a fire. I mean, it's an imperfect world. And sometimes you have a fire. And thank God for those men and women who will put on the protective gear and go in there to the fire, put their own lives in danger to protect those who are vulnerable and hurting and in horrible danger. And sometimes in this fallen world you have a crime, and thank God for those young men and women who will pin a badge on their chest and stand up against the bad guys and protect the innocent. And sometimes in this fallen world you have a war. And thank God for those wonderful young men and women who will don a uniform and stand up and defend the shores of our nation against those who would do our citizens and our country harm. Then I told her a little story from my favorite book. My favorite book's about that thick. It's divided into two parts. There's the older part and the newer part. This was a story from the newer part. I told her about a guy who was just walking along, minding his own business. And suddenly a bunch of bad guys jumped on him. I mean, they pounded him. They took all of his clothes off. They took all of his possessions, and they beat him to the point that he was almost dead, and they left him laying alongside the road. And along came a chaplain, and the chaplain looked at him and said, "Man, that's disgusting. That guy must be on drugs or an alcoholic or something." And the chaplain scurried on off to the chaplain. And after that, along came a chaplain assistant, and the chaplain assistant looked at him a little closer and said, "Man, that guy's really in trouble. I wish I could help him, but I better get to the chapel or the chaplain's going to be really upset." And then a little later, along came a member of a cursed outcast group, a JAG. And the JAG pulled his BMW up by the guy, and the JAG got out and looked at him, and the JAG wiped up the blood, and the JAG bandaged up his wounds, and the JAG gently lifted him up and put him in the back of his 525 or 535 or whatever it is. And the JAG drove him to the Marriott Hotel, and the JAG got a room for him, and then the JAG pulled out his credit card, and he said, "Look, now, I want to leave my credit card on file." He said, "I want you to take meals to him every day. I want you to take care of him, and just charge it to my bill." Now, you know the story. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. And it's a story that is applauded by religions throughout the world. I mean, Hindus love it, Buddhists love it, Muslims love it, Jewish people love it. Of course, it's basically a Christian story, but it's world-renowned as being one of the most wonderful stories in the whole wide world in the history of civilization to tell us how we ought to treat one another. But let's think of that story and back it up just a half hour. Let's say that the Good Samaritan was coming along and he saw the guy getting beat up. I mean, they were jumping on him, and they were tearing his things away, and they were pounding on him, and his life was in danger. They were coming close to killing him. They were ruining his life. They were setting on him. And the Good Samaritan sees this. What would be the right thing to do then? What would be the decent, moral, ethical thing to do? I submitted to you this morning that the right thing to do, the decent, moral, ethical thing to do, would be to stop the violence and protect the innocent and rescue the victims. Well, what if you have to hurt the bad guy? Hurt the bad guy. Stop the violence, rescue the innocent. Well, what if you have to use force? Use force. Stop the violence, rescue the innocent, do what's ethically right. That, my friends, that is one of the most brilliant arguments ever made, not with those words, but by St. Augustine, and he called it the just war theory. But let's back it up, not just a half hour, but a whole hour. And let's say that the Good Samaritan was coming along, and he looks down and he sees this poor traveler just going along, but nothing has happened, nothing at all. But the Good Samaritan looks up into the rocks and he sees a bunch of bad guys. He recognizes them. They're murderers and they're thugs. He knows them. They already have a bad reputation, and everybody knows what they do. They have their bows pulled back. They have their swords out. They're just waiting for this guy to come around the corner, and they're going to pounce on him, and they're going to endanger his life. So then what's the right thing to do? I say the right thing to do is to protect the innocent, defend the vulnerable, and go after the bad guys. What if you have to use force? Use force. What if you have to hurt one of the bad guys? Hurt him. What if you have to kill him? Kill him. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do. It is the values pure thing to do. That is known, my friends, as the preemptive strike theory. So the next time some leftist flag-burning wacko jumps on you for wearing a uniform, you just tell him that your chaplain says that you're being a good Samaritan. I've talked enough. Let me say thank you. Thank you for wearing the uniform of the United States of America. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you stand for. Thank you for what you do and have done for your country. I salute you, not just with my hand, but with my heart. And I say, God bless you, and God bless America.